Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Lord Speaker's lecture, which comes, in fact, from my office, which I, sad to say, vacate in a couple of days' time. The packing cases are all around me, but behind me are books that have been donated by the present generation of peers to the library we have here. Michael Heseltine, William Hay, Douglas Hurd, John Prescott, David Blunkett, and many more, including, I think, the two guests tonight. So this is the third part of our virtual lecture series of 2021, and we've so far heard from some fascinating speakers, Lady Aurelia Young on her father, sculptor Oscar Nemon, Baroness Martha Lane Fox on the future of technology, and tonight a very special event. Indeed, we're joined by Ken Clarke and Peter Mandelson. Ken will reflect on his 5 decades in Parliament with sharp questions and interventions from Peter Mandelson. Sadly, this will be my last lecture as Lord Speaker, but I'm glad to say the series will continue under the new Lord Speaker, John McFall. So, moving on to the main event, it's a great pleasure to welcome both Ken and Peter. Ken and I joined the House of Commons together in 1970 from neighbouring constituencies in Nottinghamshire, and then we worked together in government in the departments of transport to begin with, and then health and social security. We were in the Thatcher government together, and we fought side by side for John Major, against, I have to say, some formidable foes, not least Peter Mandelson. As we were doing our utmost to keep John Major in, he was doing his utmost to keep him out. And in 1997, he succeeded beyond, I suspect, even his own dreams. So there is lots to talk about. Just a word about the organisation. Tonight will be structured slightly differently to our previous physical lectures. Most prominently, it will not be possible for members of the audience to unmute their microphone. So if you wish to submit a question, please do so in writing via the chat box. The Q&A function is open now, and it will be moderated by the staff from my office here. All questions will be taken at the end, but please feel free to submit your questions throughout the whole of the evening. And just to finally add this, the lecture is being recorded, including the question and answer. So this is not, I repeat, not under Chatham House rules, and a copy will be made available online after the lecture is over. Now, it's with therefore very great pleasure that I will hand over first to Peter Mandelson and allow the questioning to begin. So Peter, over to you.
Norman, thank you very much indeed for giving me this opportunity to take Ken Clarke down memory lane back to the 1970s, where I intend to start in a moment. But it's a particular pleasure for me to do this because we three, you, Norman, Ken and I, were together, you would not have realised this, in a manner of speaking, way back in the early 1980s. You were both freshly appointed Conservative transport ministers. Ken was a mere parliamentary undersecretary. And I was the even younger, freshly appointed and very lowly researcher and parliamentary aide to Labour's then shadow transport secretary, Albert Booth. So this event is a happy reunion for us three, because I spent many hours and days in committee rooms as you took your awful draconian right-wing transport privatising legislation through the House of Commons, and I was trying to brief Albert in his opposition to it. So 40 years on, we mark Norman, your passage to the next instalment of your public life. Ken, let me start a little bit before I first encountered you and Norman in the early 1980s. Start in the 1970s, if I may, which was a decade widely seen under Ted Heath, Harold Wilson, and Jim Callaghan as the last decade of the post-war settlement and the consensus that underpinned it. And what I want to ask you first of all, if I may, is what did you feel at the time in the 1970s? Did it feel as if we were coming to the end of a post-war era? Did it feel as if we were sort of drinking in the last chance saloon of that post-war consensus? And what did you see as the elements of the sea change that Jim Callaghan alluded to towards the end of his own premiership? Ken?
Well, thank you, Peter. I was going to think you'd leave the 70s out because you're a complete youngster, and I hadn't realised you went back so far. I thought you were, right. You know, Norman and I had half our career behind us before we even joined the House of Commons, but I'm delighted to hear you were so involved. Oh, it was the end of an era. Now, I think our analysis, which, as you say, is a pretty cliche-ridden consensus, that was the end of the post-war consensus, is correct, and we're in the middle of it. Whether I sensed it at the time, I'm not quite sure, but the fact that it was a dreadful decade, everything fell apart, except in one respect. My career has a curious symmetry about it. When I got elected in 1970 as a bright, new, shiny, over-keen Tory, I was mad keen that we were joining the European Union, the European community. Ted Heath was committed to that. He put me in the whip's office. I was a junior whip. I helped get the cross-party majority, which managed to get us into the European community. Both parties divided. So the first 2 or 3 years of my office would take it up, my parliamentary career, with almost the exact reverse of the disaster that came at the end of it 50 years later. But thereafter, the 70s were hopeless. Harold Wilson had tried to get us out of the 60s nightmare, where we'd become an industrial laughingstock, militant trade unionism, rampant inflation, strikes every year, public sector unions in for tea and biscuits with the Prime Minister, getting a settlement that was far more than anybody afford, more inflation. On it went. Harold Wilson and Barbara Castle tried trade union reform. Heath tried trade union reform. It failed. And then the rest of the 70s were a complete disaster, not helped by an oil crisis because the OPEC countries started driving up oil. We had dreadful economic policies, statutory prices and incomes policy, just a target for every trade unionist to beat before he started his negotiations. Your members were a special case. You had to get the Prime Minister to declare, and then above that, you saw how much you could get. And that destroyed both governments. We went to the IMF, and by the end of the 1970s, it wasn't clear how we were going to move on. Poor old Jim, who might have got re-elected, he'd have had less of a defeat if he'd gone in the autumn the year before he went, was absolutely betrayed by the trade unions in the winter, with the winter of discontent, when it's one of the worst we had. Everybody was on strike, and it made him unre-electable, and we got back. And you've got Margaret Thatcher, who probably might not have won if it hadn't been for if the trade unions had only behaved with prices and incomes policy for a few months at least in the winter to get Labour back again. But it was the end, and I personally was content with that. The Europe thing, when I first got in, was all part of my desire to see the country modernised. I felt frustrated. We were in this dreadful post-war consensus which wasn't working. We're all doing what we're doing again now, basking in the glories of our great fight in 1940 in the Second World War. The world owes the living, nothing had to change, and we were busily fighting with each other and falling into stagnation. And then there was a better chance. The reason I became a Tory, really, was I thought at least Heath and Europe offered us the chance of entering the modern world and modernising. By the end of the decade, it was screamingly obvious to everybody in any sense in all political parties that we needed somehow to get out of this and to modernise.
Well, let me ask you, Ken, what sort of conservative you were, because I had the distinct impression, having read your excellent memoirs, that before you entered Parliament, and certainly at Cambridge, you were a Macmillanite, one nation conservative, you know, who felt a responsibility to the poor, to the welfare state, and to those regions of the country that were not doing so well. How easily was it accomplished, therefore, by you, as we turn into the 1980s, to become a thoroughly loyal Thatcherite? I mean, who you served selflessly throughout the 1980s. I mean, were you sort of operating during that decade as an undercover wet, or were you indeed converted to her form of modernization?
No, I wasn't wet. I mean, I'm one of those rare politicians, rare people, really. My political principles were pretty well formed by the time I was elected. They got very much formed during the 20s. So when I was a student politician, I was a one nation conservative. I was described in the battles of the early Thatcher years as one of the wets. And when pressed, I used to say to interviewers, yes, of course I'm a wet. I'm a social liberal and all the rest of it. I'd had the battles with hanging, which we had inside our party 10 years before. Europe divided our party. All the old imperialists went on off with Enoch Powell to oppose our joining Europe. And I was a modernizer. And I wanted to see us modernized as a country. And with hindsight, you will find I get more enthusiastic in my defence of the Thatcher government. She was of the four prime ministers I was in government with, she was the one I liked least. Personally, you know, we got on. We had a lot of terrible rows, but she didn't mind having terrible rows with half her ministers. Nigel had far worse rows than I had with her. But it wasn't my sort of Tory lady. But the restructuring which she was doing, I thought would eventually lead to a modern, and then I hoped civilized, capitalist, free market economy with social justice. Well, the Labour Party has developed a mythology which you've gone back to. If I say so, the major achievement of the John Major government, with a surprise win in 1992, was to consolidate all the fantastic structural reforms of the Thatcher years. And then Blair, with you as his absolute right-hand man, his right arm, took over, and you didn't change a thing, you didn't reverse a thing, you actually went on to consolidate the Thatcher reforms. Now, you and I, you know, you're centre-left, I'm centre-right. I suspect both of us thought the tone and style of Margaret at times was pretty hair-raising. She was more liberal than people think she was. But in economics, she was a real Manchester liberal. She was a really way out, uncomplicated, root and branch, free market, small government woman. But otherwise, the changes she made with hindsight were necessary. What we didn't do, neither the Major or Blair government, was mitigate the consequences for the communities that lost their dead 19th century industries, that had to change their working practices, that had to accept modern methods of production, had to move into a service economy, had to make Britain competitive again. Lots of older white working class people, the backbone of the old trades union movement, we kind of thought would benefit, you know, and would slot in somehow. And with great respect, I don't think the Blair government did any more about that problem than the Major government was able to achieve. I actually think it's a really big problem for us now. And I think nobody's got the first idea what to do about it now, quite honestly. Levelling up's a great phrase. if it's just building a few more roads, when Norman and I were Transport Secretary, getting a bit nearer back to your question, we were building roads everywhere, and I'm sure they did a lot of good for the villagers, the bypasses and so on. But the idea you revive the economy of Rotherham or Hartlepool by giving it another road is a complete myth.
Or another roundabout, or another hanging basket.
Or all the rest of it. Yes, that's right. People can't even doing anything except building something.
Look, I would accept that New Labour judged that the privatisation of the utilities was not reversible, that the trade unions had to continue to operate within a framework of law. We adjusted it, but we didn't really reverse it. And we actually tried not to go back to the sort of old corporatism of the 60s and 70s. We did want to sustain a dynamic economy, but here is perhaps the difference. And we did, by the way, try to champion, as she had done and as John did, aspiration in society. But what we really insisted on doing was trying to reintroduce a bit of social justice. And I think I understand your point about Margaret's modernization or overhaul or structural changes in the economy. But do you not think that in her overhaul of the economy, she was too oblivious to the social consequences of what she was doing, and that if she hadn't been quite as divisive then, we wouldn't be so much in need of the levelling up now?
Her style was divisive, and I think, yes, I do think one of my criticisms of Margaret would be I don't think she was sensitive enough to the social consequences of what was going on, but not entirely. Now, the one thing, I'm sorry, I'm the first one to introduce a political conflict between two people, you and I, who are not really that very far apart and are both rather out of fashion at the moment. But I won't go back to that. But
speak for yourself.
Margaret also believed the principle of one nation was equality of opportunity. And she believed, and Tony Blair used to say the same thing as it happens, but benefits, shouldn't be a handout, they should be a hand up. That you give every opportunity to people to actually recover from their problems, you support them, have a social conscience and all the rest of it. That's why she eventually moved on to the education reforms and the reforms of public service and so on. And she, to be fair, when I was Health Secretary, her starting point was she wanted to privatise it and go American and private insurance. And it took, well over 10 furious meetings with a shouting match at times to get her to accept what I tried to persuade her was my equally free market response, which was to have a modern management with a purchaser-provider divide, but to stick to the principles of the NHS. The idea that Margaret was it's a myth propagated by the left, widely believed by the young, accepted by most people under the age of 40, that she was an evil woman who plotted the downfall of the working class and sort of destroyed these marvellous industries and so on. But the fact is, I come from a coal mining county, Nottinghamshire. The idea that it was possible in the 21st century to have all those pit heads and those smoking tips and so on all over my county as the basis of the economy, and those splendid blue-collar, trade unionised, white working class people in the labour movement voting for nothing to change, really, since the Attlee Order had been introduced. It was doomed, and it had to change, and I accepted that.
I think people might say that she was rather better at ending time-limited industry than she was at generating and creating new sources of industrial enterprise and employment. I mean, her emphasis and focus on financial services at the expense of manufacturing was well known. Can I ask you though about something?
Up to a point,
yeah.
Financial services has actually done wonders to improve the overall wealth of the country and living standards. We haven't succeeded in regulating it and curbing the excesses too often. The shift from manufacturing into services was a desirable thing and is an irreversible thing. But I do agree with you, it's gone too far. We did fail, and I think it was a historic government. I think the Attlee and the Thatcher governments are the best governments this country's had since the war. They transformed the country at the end compared to when they came in, and they transformed it for the better in the context of the times. We did misjudge, and I've already conceded it in a way, that we didn't think there was going to be this lasting and permanent effect on sections of society, and nor did we foresee that the benefits of the new economy were not going to be spread out properly. So the widening divide between those who really thrived under the new economy and those who suffered, and the gaps between the rich and the poor, which have got worse steadily throughout Major Thatcher, Major Blair, and other governments over the last 20 odd years. We still haven't worked out quite how to address that. But the fundamental reforms that I worked on, I don't regret, I defend. And you didn't mention education and
no,
health.
I was going to ask you about this. I mean, look, just on the economy, I'm one of those who would like to reindustrialize our economy on the basis of our superb science and technology base, which I think
a modern technology base. Yeah, you and I, as opportunities it's actually through many areas, you and I agree. I bet we do. What we'd like to see by way of modern manufacturing.
Let me ask you though about public service reform, because this does interest me. I mean, I thought that Mrs. Thatcher was quite cautious about tinkering with the National Health Service and other public services, whereas Blair wanted to sort of go beyond Thatcher. He wanted to wade in deeper into reform of the public sector. What I want to ask you though is looking back, why was reform of public services so incredibly difficult for you and for Ken Baker and others, and indeed for our ministers too? And looking back over the record of public service reform, did any of us get it right?
I think we very much got it right. The health service and the education system still have lots and lots of problems. They're always crisis ridden, but they're infinitely better than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago, out of sight better than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. Margaret was reluctant at first, that was political. She had a kind of agenda. First term, trade union reform and getting people used to a more free market thing. Second term, more aggressively free market, particularly, as after crushing high interest rates and things to get rid of inflation following what Volcker was doing in America, we were getting the economy picking up again. By the third term, I don't know how many terms she thought she was going to have, but after 1987, it's quite obvious she decided now for the public services. Now, first education, they wanted education reform, and then health. Now, they were, ever since, in all Western democracies, they are far more controversial than all this economic stuff. If you wish to have a row with the public in any Western country, try changing the education system or try changing the health system. Ever since Nye Bevan, every health secretary has been deeply unpopular, unless he was one of the useless ones who just sat there and did nothing and just tried to satisfy the lobbies. I mean, the BMA were describing Nye Bevan as a medical furor as they aroused rage against him when he founded it. And it's happened ever since. The public are very suspicious of changing either of them, and they're very unionized, and although the people who work in them are very civilized people, they're often represented by people who are fundamentally against changing. But as you say, you took over after all the trouble I'd had in getting my health reforms, education reforms. You actually, Alan Milburn, I used to have jokes with him, saying that you could have interchanged the speeches the two of us made when Tony made him Secretary of State for Health. And actually he was, because he was a Labour minister, was able to take them much further than I would have tried.
Don't you think it's interesting, therefore, that what Matt Hancock is now doing is rolling back both the Clarke reforms and the Milburn reforms and reinstating an original structure and design pre-Lansley of the National Health Service. They're
He's in danger of going back to a centralised bureaucratic system if he's not careful. I forgive him, actually. I'm ambiguous. It's too easy for people like me to immediately say, good grief, you're threatening the purchase and provider divide. You're making one big monolithic system. You're reducing their accountability. You're reducing checking value for money, which means more output for the patients for the money, if you get it right. What he's actually doing is tackling a different problem, which is integrating the different parts of healthcare. That there is no doubt that the hospital service, GPs and general practice, community services, local authority workers, they're all run differently, they're all in a little silo, and the patient needs them all to work on a patient-oriented, focused thing where they actually cooperate individual patient by individual patient and actually produce the best results. Now, he's finding it difficult to combine that without losing the undoubted gains that were achieved in the earlier era, when we finally stopped trying to run the whole health service on the basis of a centralized bureaucracy which could possibly actually effectively run such a vast organization, subject to every kind of being lobbied like crazy by every local group, every union, the BMA, the Royal College of Nursing, and all the rest of it. It needed reform. It was a dying shambles until we had a go at it in the late 1980s.
I think, interestingly, what he's also trying to usher in is an additional sort of revolution, and that is a digital revolution to the operation of the health service, and how he's going to
understand that. It's not my
I think there are great opportunities there. Can I ask you, though, about Europe and go back to what you originally said about Europe and your party? I mean, for so long, the Conservative commitment had been so strong, whilst my own party equivocated over Europe. What, in your view, caused the Conservative Party in the 1990s to flip, in the way that it did? I mean, can you point to a particular moment or event, or was there some underlying structural change that was taking place within the party? What was it that caused the Conservatives to flip over Europe?
Well, both parties always split over Europe, but most other things. The Conservative Party is usually led by its centrist, moderate, modernising people, and a lot of its followers, particularly outside the House of Commons, are more right-wing, reactionary and nostalgic. And the Labour Party is a complete mirror image, usually led by Islington and Hampstead, but outside it's got lots of left-wing, really right-wing, very reactionary people. But both parties, the reason we've been in office more often than the Labour Party is because our sort of North London elite, as it's now called, has been in control more often than yours has been able to get control of the Labour Party. That's just about summed up the post-war situation. And now it started with Macmillan. My first party conference was when Harold Macmillan was explaining to an extremely hostile party conference why he had made an application to join the European community. And he had me and John Gummer and students, we were little lads really, in the audience wearing Europe badges, thrilled by all this. And I think the thing that had made me so determined to support this was the recent memory of Suez. It was the debacle of Suez, and people forget it now. Utterly, the sense that this was ludicrous, that we were still claiming to play this sort of post-imperial role in the world on our own. And as I've already said, while the economy was becoming a joke as we were getting left behind by the countries we defeated in the war that we kept going on about all the time, and Europe was a kind of symbol of moving on. Now, de Gaulle stopped us joining, but quite a large body of the parliamentary party and the leadership of the Conservative Party kept that on board. Heath was a fanatic. It was the one thing that Heath on other politics was a very, very shaky. I mean, the economic policy that before we were defeated was getting madder and madder. But he on Europe, made me, if you had Heath with us now, he'd make me sound like a Eurosceptic. It was his one thing he was dedicated to. And the Conservative Party does tend, in the end, to decide it wants power, it wants to be elected. The leader somehow is able to keep the party on the rails quite easily. And the fact he won the election in 1970, to everybody's slight surprise, gave him the authority to overrule it. Now, in your party, when you say your party was quite doubtful, your party was dead against a lot of it. It split. The Jenkinsites were as pro-European as Ted Heath and his other followers. Your people in the Labour Party, you weren't there then. But we only got into the European community because I was in the Whip's office. One of my jobs was to negotiate with, I've forgotten the man's name now, it's a colleague of mine in the House of Lords now. I used to negotiate with a young Jenkinsite on the other side about how many of them were going to stay away tomorrow night because we were risking a defeat. And if they didn't want to be deselected by voting with us every night, but we negotiated how many were going to clear off, miss the division and abstain to get the blasted bill through the House of Commons. And the majority, we got it through Parliament with a combination of Heathites and Jenkinsites, and with the left of the Labour Party and the right of the Conservative Party, led by Enoch Powell and Michael Foot, in fierce opposition. But that was my first Parliament.
Ken, let me take you back to the 1990s. Do you think that if you had been more stout, all of you, more robust, like Ted and his whips were in the 1970s, if you'd taken a more robust approach to your anti-European right wing in the 1990s, as I think Michael Heseltine was urging at the time, could you not have staunched this revolt and reversed it? I mean, were you strong enough in the 1990s?
Well, as you say, Hezza and I might have been tempted to do so. Whether we were right, I'm not quite sure. The state of affairs, the rift in our party over Europe had steadily become worse. It had worsened quite sharply. It became all wrapped up with the fall of Margaret Thatcher. The Thatcherites, the hardline Thatcherites, persuaded themselves that it was all a kind of plot by pro-Europeans that had brought down their heroine and brought her to an end. And if you were, a sympathiser of Margaret's afterwards, and she, I'm afraid, declining somewhat in her powers as she did in her later years, had been persuaded it was all a European plot, and she became much more ferociously anti-European than she had been when she was in office. She was never against Europe as an economic venture. She was largely responsible for the single market. But by the time we got into the, what am I talking about? The 80s now. No, the 90s. The right of the party, and particularly the Thatcher loyalists, were convinced that this pro-European stuff was all a great betrayal. And Maastricht, not a frightfully important treaty really, well it was, but most people in this country don't know why it was or what it did. And at the time, half the people arguing about it didn't either. We had some bizarre debates. But Maastricht, the battle over Maastricht, became symbolic of this. And you're quite right. Hezza and I, with Douglas Hurd, were John Major's right-hand man. And you wouldn't be surprised to know that Hezza and I used to try to persuade John to take him on, be more robust and all that kind of thing. When we got defeated in the committee stage, I was the one who insisted we made it a vote of confidence, and I was the one who we still hesitating. So I told the press we were making it a vote of confidence. So one of the few times I've done that, it's a daily habit now for people to do it, and actually personally try to sort one or two people out to make sure we won it. Hezza would have made me pale in, I think, to being a bit of a teaser compared with him. Now, with hindsight, John, I'm very close to John, and John just shared the same views on Europe and things. John's style was different, and I'm not sure that if Hezza had beaten Margaret and all the rest of it and just taken them on, or if I somehow had emerged from some crisis, we probably wouldn't have lasted more than a couple of months. We'd have brought it down. The party management does matter in all political parties, and Michael and I might have made a mess of that. And John Major, like most prime ministers I've known, put party management very high in his list of priorities.
I want to ask you about the party in a moment. Just one last question about Europe. Is it true that you tried to persuade John Major not to close down the option of joining the European currency, and that actually you hope that Labour might well take us in after we were elected?
Oh, yeah, it certainly is. I made desperate efforts to stop him ruling out the single currency. I was in favour of the single currency. And John wanted to say we wouldn't. Then he made an option, and he wanted to hold a referendum on it. I was flatly against referendums, which are a daft way of running a country. We managed to stop him. We conceded to him. John got so miserable about the fact that Hezza and I were being so awkward about it. I mean, it's the only time in my entire career I did make it clear, we didn't have a stand-up row or anything, but I made it clear I would resign if he held a referendum on the single currency. And I go out and campaign in favour of the damn thing. Eventually, we conceded to him because we didn't want to upset. We were his closest supporters. We didn't want to block him in this way. We came up with this bizarre answer that we would never join the single market in the future without a referendum. And Michael and I have agreed in conversation several times since that was the worst political mistake we have made in our political careers, the one we most regret. But John went off and thought he would quieten down the Eurosceptics, we'd hear no more about it, just like Cameron thinking he'd hear no more about it once he'd given them a referendum, and it'd all be over. And of course, when they announced all this, it was a great victory, as it was for the Eurosceptics. So, now, I thought we were going to lose to your lot anyway. So this daft promise would die when we got in. So I was dismayed about 2 days later when I certainly had a conversation with Tony Blair. I cannot remember whether P. Mandelson was present. Doesn't look as though you were. I really can't remember whether you were with him or not. And I, by this time, was complaining to him because he'd said, yes, we'll do the same. So I complained to Tony in the corridors of the House of Commons. What are you doing this for? What on earth are you doing this for? And of course, he quite rightly, he was correct. He said, well, what have you, what's your government done? What do you think I could go to do on the eve of election? He got his left to worry about.
I think,
and he'd left you with no choice but to agree with the same proposition.
I think you'll find the answer to that question if you dial M for Murdoch. Can I ask?
Murdoch never had a great influence on me, I have to say.
I think he possibly had a slightly greater influence on Tony Blair.
He did on most prime ministers, unfortunately.
Our time is against us, but we've got a little bit more time. Can I just ask you to put yourself in your former Chancellor shoes, your former Chancellor Brown-Groves. Rishi Sunak is facing some very, very tough fiscal choices now on tax and public spending, with his Prime Minister taking a sort of characteristically cakeist approach of wanting more spending, more borrowing, and absolutely no tax increases. I mean, faced with the same pressures in your day, post ERM, you opted for a roughly sort of 50-50 split between tax increases and spending cuts, if I remember roughly, unlike George Osborne, who was more 90-10 in favour of spending cuts. I mean, what would you do? What would your advice to Rishi Sunak be now? How should he sort of resolve his fiscal dilemmas?
He actually is fiscally, along the same lines as me, I think, personally, but as a new member of parliament, new minister, new chancellor, I'm sure faces problems inside the government, but he's done pretty well, really. And I approve of the fact he's constrained. It's a great pity, but he's constrained spending in quite a lot of government departments outside of the COVID field, and he's going to have to continue to do that. The debt we have was necessarily incurred. I think it was right, and it was a pretty good package on the whole to have gone in for the spectacular programme of support to prevent companies collapsing and so on, the furloughing, but most of the other spending. Don't approve of all of it, not the stamp duty holiday and all that stuff, but it was pretty good. The debt is now very frightening. At the moment, he'll be under great pressure. Well, ignore that, it's free money. You don't have to pay interest on it anymore. We can finance it easily. One day it'll go up again, inflation and interest rates, but we'll cross that bridge when we reach it. That is very dangerous. We could reach that bridge in the next couple of years, and the debt would then become a real nightmare if we just suddenly found that first inflation and then interest rates were rising. We're going to have a bit of a boost this autumn. That's not itself bad, but I think it's a real risk, given the scale of fiscal support we put in, and in a couple of years' time, finding a mounting financial crisis in quite a lot of the Western countries. I think the States has overdone it, actually. I think they're going to see inflation come back. I agree with Larry Summers, who was Secretary of State, Finance Secretary, Treasury Secretary at my time when I was Chancellor. Inflation's a real danger in America now. It could be here, and once interest rates get up, you're in a mess. So he's got to carry on doing what's necessary to get the government out of COVID, spending more money on things necessary to save us from the economic scarring. So there's got to be a lot more money spent on skills training and job searching and so on for the young and the over 50s. He's got to spend money on social care, whose inadequacies have been revealed, which means other departments have got to be constrained, and he's got to be ready to raise taxation. And so long as you raise taxation fairly, then you can succeed. You've got to do what politicians won't do now, which is go out and argue the unpopular case. I spent half my life announcing things that weren't popular when I announced them, and I knew they wouldn't be popular when they announced them. But the public are more sensible than the media and the political classes. If you go out and argue your case and explain why you're doing it, and if you explain what the national interest is that you're pursuing, in a couple of years' time, when your policies have settled down and actually might seem to be doing a bit of good, it's amazing how you can move on. Now, that's now regarded as a very old-fashioned approach to politics. You have some public relations guy who's employed in Number 10 who comes in and tells you that a focus group doesn't approve of what you're thinking of doing, and so you don't do it. Rishi's got to be a million miles from that, because we'll have euphoria when we do get back to new normality, and we do have a bit of a mini boom, particularly in the sectors that have been hit, like restaurants and bars. They're going to be, difficult to book into them for a few months. They're all going, the ones that survived are going to recover, and all that. Against that background, Rishi's got to do what every chancellor should do, which is think, where are we going to be in 3, 4, 5 years' time? How do I keep a healthy economy? How do I look for a modern economy to be supported, a green economy, a digital economy? Don't give in to blasted lobbies. And unfortunately, we've got ourselves such a colossal amount of debt until we start getting it down. We're going to have to be pretty tough on those government departments coming in every year saying that this year it's absolutely vital they have an increase, a massive increase in their budget.
Okay, I'm going to hand back to Norman in a moment, but before I do, I want to ask you one last question, not about PR people in Number 10 who overly use focus groups. I couldn't agree with you more. They all need to be cleaned out of politics. My last question to you is this about the Conservative Party and yourself? I mean, given the Conservative Party's current nationalism or anti-Europeanism. It's sort of disregard on occasions for international law, and its disregard for ministerial standards, and indeed the health of our own democracy. If you were a young man, Ken, now entering politics, do you think you would be joining the Conservatives?
I might hesitate, I'm not sure. I mean, I am a mainstream Conservative. You know, anybody from outside this country trying to work out what the Conservative, because they're both strange institutions, what the Conservative Party and what the Labour Party is. Look, as somebody like me, my career, my views, I'm not particularly left-wing Conservative on a lot of things. I'm a mainstream Conservative. I'm currently in the position of being not the most, overjoyed Conservative. I'm in exactly the same position that you were when Corbynistas took over your party. And there are thousands of people like us who agree with us, both in your party and mine. Up and down the country, there are people who think, well, the Conservative Party is not quite the Conservative Party that I used to be in, but I'm still a Conservative. And in the interests of sound and stable government, I do believe in party politics and the two-party system. And I do know that I believe essentially in free markets, one nation conservatism, free markets with a social conscience, internationalism, and so on. And I'm a Conservative through and through. It's just at the moment the party is going through a mood which is more in touch with my more right-wing colleagues than it is with people like me, which I've already said is a position, a situation you must feel rather familiar with in recent years.
But you're different because you've been a candidate for the leadership of your party and I haven't. Do you think the biggest mistake that the Conservatives made, and indeed Labour made before, was in transferring the franchise in the election of our leaders exclusively from our MPs to our grassroots? I mean, do you think that we've both paid a price in our party empowering these ideological grassroots members of our parties?
I mean, a lot of my best friends genuinely are, of course, activist members of Conservative associations. I know a lot of very nice Conservative Party activists, and some of my best friends. But the fact is, as a whole, and it's what's destroying every Western democracy. I mean, normal Western democracy, as we knew it 30 years ago, is collapsing in every one of the Western democracies. Populism, polarization, multi-party governments, protest votes, they've all got the lot. And the fundamental system in America and Western Europe is being shaken everywhere. And the problem is that the parliamentarians, the ones faced with the day-to-day responsibility of governing a country in a dangerous and complicated world, have different views from the mass of their activist followers in the countryside. It's a problem that faces moderate Christian Democrats, moderate members of the Democratic Party in America, moderate Labour, moderate Conservatives everywhere. And election results become ever more volatile, mainly angry protests, peculiar results. And one of the roots of it that got it really going in Britain was exactly what you say. It was a disastrous mistake to stop the leader of the party being elected by the parliamentarians, because they all know him or her. They're going to have to live with him or her every day. They know who they want to lead them through unpopular as well as the popular decisions they know that every responsible government's got to make. It was a disastrous turning point for both our parties.
Okay.
On that note, I better pass back to our democratically elected outgoing Lord Speaker.
Not the only democratically elected person in this place. Thank you. I mean, fascinating stuff. I mean, I was fascinated by, of course, about the health service. And the trouble with the National Health Service in the 1980s, I found when I was doing the job, was it was all very well. We were under such attack that Margaret Thatcher said the National Health Service is safe with us. The only trouble was that it wasn't really safe with her because, of course, she had an entirely different concept of how health should be provided. So, not surprisingly, we had a few battles to fight in that area, and I put that very moderately. But now I've got a few questions that have come in. One is from John Burt, who you both doubtless sent letters to him complaining about the coverage for the Labour Party or the coverage for the Conservative Party. But John asks, what has to happen before we again have a government of the centre left or the centre right? Peter, what do you feel about that?
The first thing we have to do is to, from a centre left point of view, is to take back control of the Labour Party, modernise it, have it own understand, interpret properly and own the future, and completely refresh its appeal to the public and make itself into a truly national party again. And once we've done that, as I'm fully convinced that Keir Starmer will do, we'll be well on our way.
Ken?
If you were to do that, you'd almost certainly win, Peter. Your conviction that you're on the way to doing it, we won't get on to contemporary politics. I don't think you're making much progress at the moment, but that's it's enough of the marriage here. What if we are to see the survival of the centre-left, centre-right politics, which has dominated the democracies of the Western world? Certainly the democracies used to dominate the democracies of the United States, Germany, France, and Britain, and many other countries as well. You need a leadership to emerge that is capable of winning public confidence and managing its party to deliver that. I mean, the Blairite revolution, where Tony, Peter, and slightly different, slightly more 70 tax way Gordon Brown actually turned the ridiculous Labour Party that we were being faced with in the 1980s into a winning election machine. It was an example. I don't see in any Western democracy, the retirement of Angela Merkel deeply, deeply saddens me, because I'm a huge admirer of her. But you do need to have people emerging capable of leading a country as well as a party into that particular path. And it's not impossible, because the public, you know, are not just people who answer opinion polls, full stop. The public are sensible, intelligent, reasonable people by and large. And when pressed, they have sensible, reasonable, intelligent views. And you can persuade them that, I know for a Conservative, that their taxes have to go up. Or you can persuade them, if you're Labour, that you have to go in for something that is, you know, defying socialist principle. But it requires people of the capacity and the presentational skills that occasionally emerge. And I think there's been a bit of dearth of those in recent years, and partly again because of populist politics. So show business personalities and larger than life characters tend to emerge as leaders now, rather than articulate, eloquent, persuasive political figures. Most politicians, who are obviously politicians, are held in contempt by most of the public, because they think they're all rogues and in it will get out of it, and all kinds of exaggerated nonsense. But then they prefer a sort of Donald Trump type figure who's not really a politician, but says outrageous things, but he's a bit of a lad, and that just gives you chaos if those people are able to win elections, win party support against the high quality professional politicians who have the job of steering party and country down sensible, realistic lines.
Okay, let me just follow that up. Ken, a question to you. If it's anonymous, the questioner, if the Conservative Party goes into opposition, is there any chance the internationalist liberal wing will be able to assert itself, or is the populist right in charge? Is the position that the populist right is in charge, is that the position for good?
There's every chance. If the party gets defeated, parties, any party, unless they've completely lost their marbles, and the Conservative Party certainly hasn't, begins by having a post-mortem about exactly what went wrong. And if the party can be persuaded to have any sense, and the Conservative Party is usually particularly anxious to win elections and to have an influential role in politics, it will be open to the internationalist liberal wing of the party to persuade the party that the mistake is we've gone in for too much of this right-wing populist stuff, and we must go back to the Conservative Party of its greater days, because that's I think it's perfectly possible. Again, I make the question. I'm not teasing. I admire the Blair revolution. It's exactly what Blair, with the help of Peter, did to the Labour Party. The Labour Party was unelectable until Blair and Mandelson and others turned up, and the Labour Party had suddenly realised it was in such a hopeless position, changed. And actually, the Conservative Party, Cameron did the same thing to the Conservative Party and took back control on the part of the more moderate, internationalist, liberal wing of the party, and made the Conservative Party capable again. These things can happen in both parties, I think. It's just, I hope, just the fashion of the current last couple of years, the frenzied populism and the zealotry of extremists that brings people like Corbyn and others to the fore.
Peter, I think this is more for you. I mean, the first part of the question is whether you really expected the scale of the 1997 result. But it goes on to ask, it's Lord Khan, incidentally, goes on to ask, will there ever be a moment when you think that future elections will be about joining the EU, rather rejoining the EU, like it was in the 1970s? Will that ever be on the political agenda again?
I think it's quite possible that that will be on the agenda again, but I believe that Britain could only approach that possibility from a record of success rather than failure. I don't think we can go on our hands and knees to the European Union, having failed abysmally after Brexit, and approach them as supplicants and beg them to take us back. That is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. We have to make some sort of economic and social success of the post-Brexit period. And it's only by making as great a success as we can of this period that we will ever be in a position of contemplating re-entry to the European Union. And the second condition I would add is to do with what happens to the European Union. I believe the European Union will evolve. I think it will change. I don't think it will be a sort of monolith. I in a lecture some years ago in Oxford described, this is before the Brexit referendum, described a future for the European Union in which I saw a core union of member states who operate the European currency, but surrounded by a community of associate member states that perhaps don't use the single currency, but nonetheless want to form part of the European project in its broadest context. So I think the European Union will change. I think it will evolve, and I think it might move to a structure, an entity that makes it easier for us to contemplate some sort of associate membership. But as I say, we're not going to do that from a standpoint of weakness as supplicants. And in any case, it's not going to happen, I suspect, for a good 10 years. So it's an interesting question and hypothesis. It's some time ahead, and both we and the European Union will need to change, needed to have changed in the meantime.
Okay, now I've got an anonymous question here, but a rather important one. What changes, if any, do you think Westminster, regardless of who is in government, needs to make in the way it engages with the devolved parliaments throughout the United Kingdom to keep the United Kingdom together? And the writer to that is, do you fear for the future of the Union within the next 50 years? Ken?
Yes, well, the straightforward answer is I think we've all got to accept fully what devolution actually means, except the spirit of devolution. It's absolutely no good, constantly trying every now and again to exert some British control in some current problem and so on. We've got to accept devolution. We've got to show we're clear and willing to have devolution, and there are obviously areas of policy which you couldn't possibly devolve, but we have to deal with defence and foreign affairs as one United Kingdom. We should make it clear that we welcome the contribution of Welsh, Scots and Northern Ireland to the United Kingdom. There's a positive contribution where, we're not grudgingly having there. We don't think that we don't campaign on what dreadful things will happen to them if they go out on their own. We're all better off collectively. We're all more powerful as a nation, more prosperous. We all pull together, but the English must accept, because we're such a dominant proportion of the population, that we must just let devolution work and happen in Scotland and Wales. That would be my approach. We even in the Brexit rows, there's a slight air of pulling things back and all the rest of it. And Parliament, the Westminster Parliament's got to stop being English Parliament. It's got to win back confidence. The thing that worries me most about contemporary politics is how, in my 50 years, one of the biggest changes taking place is the power and influence of Parliament has collapsed compared with where it was in 1970. That no government could do things without the willing consent of a majority in Parliament in those days. There was the Parliament acted as a village in which the ministers were immersed, and it had a huge effect on the day-to-day conduct of affairs. Nowadays, Parliament is regarded as less important than the media, less important than populist campaigning and photo calls all over the country, and it's given up its powers. The opposition supply days, the opposition can now pass motions denouncing the government and all its works, and doesn't matter. The Conservative Party advises its followers to go home and abstain and let them pass it. There's a bit of a fuss is minor, and I'm being sarcastic here, reducing our commitment to 0.7% of GDP on overseas aid, and cutting our budget of trying to guard against famine in the Yemen by 70% and all that. And government decides it's not going to allow Parliament to have a vote on that, nothing to do with Parliament. And nobody's complaining. I mean, it just goes along. And that worries me, no more. And the threat to the Union is just one part of this growing contempt and cynicism about politics and disregard of Parliament and parliamentary democracy, which I agree in, which I think has got very, very bad, and it's been happening throughout my 50 years.
But do you feel that I'll come to Peter in just a moment. Do you feel that the argument, or the lack of argument, the lack of success of argument, means that the case for the Union is fatally damaged?
Well, again, it's this populist protest voting. And when people feel discontented and angry, then people can hold up things as a protest anti-establishment. In the case of Scotland, when they get angry, the English get angry every now and again, Scottish anger is quite easily steered into anti-London, anti-Westminster, anti-English establishment SNP feelings. Now, but you've got to argue firstly that we're both better, English and Scots being inside, saying that we welcome the Scots being in there, and just try to point out of course, the problems are enormous. To introduce a border along the line of Hadrian's Wall makes the problems of having a border with Northern Ireland and the continent fade into insignificance. It'd be even worse. But actually, all the advantages we get if they actually stay in. But the SNP are doing well. I'm afraid English reactions to them quite often encourage it. Brexit, of course, made them feel that an English political establishment and parliament was ignoring them because they were pro-European. That was symbolic of it. And the English should work hard because we've diminished ourselves as a political force in the world already, not least by Brexit, who's been declining for most of my lifetime. And we're going to further major decline in our ability to maintain our values and defend our interests if we started breaking up into the old medieval kingdoms.
Peter, what do you feel about the whole position of devolution, and particularly the position of the Union itself?
I think that many of the present government's actions and behaviour since Brexit have shown a disrespect or a disregard for devolution and the settlement that we created between the nations of the United Kingdom. I think they have acted in a provocative way, and the indifference they show, I think, is going to create a backlash, and I think we're seeing that. But I think also something more broadly is happening. I think we are not, as a political system in the UK, understanding sufficiently and working out how we come to terms with the advent of identity politics as a whole. I mean identity politics in the sense of nationalism versus unionism within the UK, but also identity politics in respect of race and of gender. We are generating and unleashing new forces propelled by social media within our politics. And I think that how we understand these forces and how we come to terms with them and how we mediate them is going to become a very big question, because without question, it's fueling both an individualism, a popularism, and a polarization, as Ken has said, which poses a threat to our union and to our political system at many levels. Now, obviously, as a former Northern Ireland Secretary, you'll not be surprised if I am most concerned about or focused on that identity clash between nationalism and unionism in Northern Ireland. I think what we are seeing is a shifting of tectonic plates in Northern Ireland, which are far greater and have far greater implications than we presently realise. And again, I don't really feel that the government is grasping what is happening, what is shifting, and what is at stake here. And I think much greater engagement by the government in understanding what is going on in Northern Ireland and how we moderate it and mediate it is going to become increasingly apparent and exert much greater pressure on our political system. But I agree with Ken. You know, we see what's happening in Scotland and Wales. There's a lot of bubbling to the surface, but I would also, lastly, like to see greater devolution in England. You know, we still operate a very centralised political system, and I would like to see greater devolution across England. I am a believer in the system of elected mayors and re-empowerment of municipal government across England, but that means letting go of powers, money, power to people and directly elected individuals on a greater scale than we're presently contemplating in England.
Thank you very much. Thanks, both of you. I think we're going to get cut off any moment in this.
Before we do, Norman, I'm sorry to interfere with your chairmanship. I think we ought to give our congratulations on the end of your speakership. For 5 years, you've been Lord Speaker. This is one way in which you're one of the main events in which you're, in Peter and myself at least, in which you're marking the end of your speakership. But it's nice to be able to do this with you just a day or two before you go. But you've been a hugely successful Lord Speaker, and I'm sure most of the audience would find those sentiments less controversial than anything else than Peter and I have said all evening. So it can be marked that this is one of the very last acts of a very successful Lord Speakership.
I would like to second that, if I may.
Well, very kind of both of you. Thank you very much. And but above all, thank you for a really fascinating and thoroughly enjoyable evening. And I couldn't have asked for a better event to end my time as Lord Speaker. And I might, if I could, just like to thank the members and the staff of both houses who've been so supportive of this lecture series over the last few years. And I hope to see you at the next one, this time from a seat in the audience. So thanks again. Thanks so much to the two speakers, Ken and Peter, and have a very good evening for the rest of the time. Thanks so much.